Hi everyone, I'm really sorry about that. It appears that we had a technical problem there. We'll start from the start, obviously, and we'll progress through the project. It appears that that's now been resolved. So I am really sorry that we've had that technical issues. As always, we're doing things in a new method here today, and that's because of COVID. We've never done a format such as this before, so there's always going to be some teething problems, but that's now been resolved. So we'll dive straight in, start the presentation again, and move forward. So it's important to start with who is on the call today. So you've got myself, I'm Connor Shearer, and I'm the Senior Property Manager for Live Group Limited. I'm responsible for day-to-day management on our lease stock schemes. Cartier and Clarence are included in that. I've been in this role since January 2019 on these developments. Next up, we've also got Neil Butterworth, who's joining us, and Neil is a Director of Design Fire Consultants. Neil has been appointed to this project, and his team have worked on this project since March 2020, and their role is to provide fire engineer scope to the project. So before we start, I'll just go through a few housekeeping rules and just let you know of the some frequently asked questions that we've had before that we want to make sure we clarify. You don't need to record the session. The session has been recorded for you, and it will be shortly shared on our website where you'll be able to view it at any point. The next session date is not set yet, but rest assured this is not only our only session. We're planning to use this format in the future. We like this format, and we think it's a great way for us to communicate with leaseholders on a group-wide basis. You may hear the term Project Artemis come up in our discussion, or you may see it on correspondence that we issue in the future. This is just an internal code name for the reports that we've conducted on the buildings, and it makes sure that our third-party vendors can differentiate between the projects that they are working on. What if your question isn't answered? Don't worry, we're tracking all the questions. Any questions that we don't get to, we'll make sure we answer in the future. We're putting together a special edition of the newsletter for in the next couple of weeks. I'll be sharing this out to everybody. How long will the session last? The session will last approximately 60 minutes. The first part will be a presentation that we've prepared for you, followed by a question and answer session with our presenters. And how do you ask the question? Well, you submit your questions to leadstock@livegroup.co.uk during the session, after the session, or even when we're not on air, if you would like any further details that you think about after the session has ended. We suggest that you start your subject line with the words Q&A and also include your building name so we can ensure that we don't miss your question. So, start with who has been working on the project. So Live are appointed by the freeholder to manage the property on a day-to-day basis. We do this in line with our management agreement and in conjunction with the leases of the building. Liv's role in this project is to work with all parties to progress the project accordingly, oversee communications and carry out the general administration of the project. Liv are independent from the freeholder, and apart from the appointment, we have no other interest in the developments. We've also got CBRE, who was appointed as the building surveyors. CBRE was appointed in August 2019 to conduct the stage 1 and then subsequently appointed to conduct the stage 2 surveys. These reports are what the fire engineers utilised in developing the risk assessments and remediation advice that is required for the buildings. We've also appointed design fire consultants, and these are appointed to the project in March 2020 following the conclusion of the stage 2 reports. Design fire reviewed the information that CBRE put together, and they've also conducted a full review, providing a detailed analysis of the situation along with the remediation advice for the buildings. So I think it's important before we get into the details of the building to actually be able to explain where we are now and how we got to this stage. So in November 2017, following government guidelines for testing on ACM cladding, we conducted a report on the building that highlighted that no ACM was present on the building. Due to that report, no further action was required at the time. However, Advice Notice 14 was issued in December 2018, and this caused for further testing in a more detailed manner, not only on the ACM elements of any building, but also on non-ACM materials. In January 2019, Liv began to plan the stage 1 surveys on portfolio. Now, a stage 1 survey is where we had the building surveyors look at the original design specifications of the building, look at the as-built documents, and also take a walk around the buildings and complete a visual inspection. To complete this, we completed a tender exercise and made sure that we approached any survey that we thought was appropriate and would be able to provide the service required. I think it is important to express to people today about how hard it was to actually appoint somebody to the surveys. This is because, obviously, following Advice Notice 14, there was a demand for surveyors on a mass scale for a large quantity of buildings across the UK. However, we did manage to engage with a large supplier that we agreed with the freeholders would be the best supplier to the project. The planning stage took place during May and July 2019, and this was a key element to getting the surveys completed. It's not just about planning on what dates we were going to do this on, we also had to include limitations such as the location of the buildings. It's key to remember that the buildings are located next to a dock and that there is weight restrictions in place for the specialised machinery that we wanted to use. In August 2019, CBRE was formally appointed to complete the surveys, and they completed a Stage 1 survey in October 2019. Following the Stage 1 survey, there was issues highlighted that meant that an EWS 1 form could not be completed. This meant that we have to complete a Stage 2 survey, which includes intrusive testing into the building in the different areas. In January 2020, the Stage 2 report was finalised and provided. Immediately after this, in February, we began the tender exercise to appoint a fire engineer to the project who would be able to provide remediation advice following these surveys. Design Fire was appointed in March 2020, and it's once again important to express that the industry has a lack of fire engineers for the scale of what is required at this time. It's really important to remember that Design Fire have provided this information in a very timely fashion and have worked very hard to get to the stage that we're at today. ARMA have recently released a report which states that to get to this level it would take roughly around 12 months, and we're satisfied that we did that in that period. The initial reports initially provided that said that we needed to complete further surveys. We began planning with these immediately, and thankfully, due to our extensive planning on the Stage 1 surveys, we was able to appoint this and get this completed in June and July 2020. These reports have now been completed, and DFC have been able to provide us with some finalised remediation reports, which we will now go into detail about. So I'll be handing over to Neil from Design Fire, who will be able to share with you the details of these reports and go through them.
Thanks, Connor. So we received the information from CBRE on the build-up of the external wall constructions that they found. The way we approach looking at these buildings, the first thing is that we consider some of the important features of the building from a fire perspective. So that includes how they're used as flats, the intended evacuation strategy being a stay put evacuation strategy, the numbers of stories and height of the building. That's important, A, because of the consequence of any fire spread that might occur, and B, because it influences whether the fire service is able to impact or reduce the fire spread from outside the building using their equipment. And similarly, we look at the perimeter access to see whether the fire service can get round the perimeter of the building and have any impact on any fire spread that may or may not occur. We then look at the building structure, and in particular the different types of external wall construction, and we assess whether those types of wall construction adequately resist fire spread. The way we do that is we use an approved document, and in this instance it's approved document B for fire safety. The approved documents are documents that are issued by government as providing practical guidance on how buildings should be built for fire safety, and it includes recommendations on how the external wall of buildings should be built and what materials they can and can't be used in those external wall constructions. When we assess the buildings, use the version of the approved document that was relevant at the time that they were built, because obviously that's the guidance that would have been followed. There's no legislative requirement for existing buildings to be brought up to the expectations of new guidance, and therefore it would be inappropriate to use more recent versions of the approved document to assess the buildings against. Also, it's worth saying that if the approved compliance with the approved document is one way of demonstrating an adequate standard, but you don't have to comply with the approved document, and sometimes an adequate level of safety can be achieved by a different method. So when we look at the wall constructions, we don't look at it in a totally black and white manner in terms of compliance with the approved document. If there are some deviations from the guidance in those documents, we consider whether those deviations are of material impact in terms of the overall safety of the building. So we're taking a pragmatic and holistic approach to the assessment of the fire safety in the buildings. So starting with Clarence House, that is really has two parts to it. There's the tower section, which is 20 stories, and then there's the lower brick clad section, which is 5 stories. For the tower, the fire service would be able to have little impact on fire spread from outside the building. For parts of the lower building, they would be able to have some impact. There are 4 external wall constructions identified on the building, but really it's dominantly on Clarence House 2 systems. There's the Techcrete concrete cladding panels that are used on the tower, and there's the brickwork that's used on the lower section. The only wall type that includes combustible materials or significant amounts of combustible materials is the brickwork. There's some insulation behind that brickwork that is combustible. This in itself is not necessarily a problem, but what should happen is that insulation should either be encapsulated in fire resisting construction so that fire can't get to it, or there should be fire breaks at at floor levels and at junctions between flats. In the inspection locations that were conducted, there were no fire barriers found in that construction. So for the lower part of the building, we are recommending that some further work is done to determine whether there is adequate protection to that insulation, and if there isn't, working out what the most cost-effective way of providing any remediation would be. For the tower and the Techcrete construction, we're satisfied that that is adequately safe, and there's no remediation required for that wall construction. We've also looked at timber balconies, and for some of the balconies, and in particular the ones on the tower, we think that the presence of the timber does create a risk that's greater than that which would be expected for compliance with the approved document, and therefore we're recommending consideration of replacement of those timber decking with a material that is not combustible. If you could just go to the next slide, please, Connor. Thank you. So this slide just describes where the various constructions are on the building, and hopefully that's reasonably clear that the tower with the red construction is the Techcrete cladding, and the lower section where it's blue is the brickwork, and there's little bits of aluminium glazed curtain walling at the lower level and glazed curtain walling on the tower in a vertical strip. Both of those constructions we're satisfied don't need remediation. If you go to the next slide, please, Connor. Thank you. So Cartier House, again, flats with a stay put evacuation strategy, 10 stories. The height of the building is such that the fire service wouldn't be able to influence fire spread from outside, certainly not for the upper parts of the building. And there's only good access to the roadway side, whereas the fire service wouldn't be able to get vehicles down to the dockside. On that building, we have identified 6 forms of construction. There's an aluminium cladding, copper cladding with some rendered with some insulated render. There's a cavity brick wall construction, some other copper cladding. There's a rock panel cladding, which is a form of panelized cladding system, and there's some Portland stone cladding. What's interesting on this building is that those systems really are not independent of each other. They all combine to, in effect, be one system over the walls of the building, which you'll see from the diagram on the next page. There are constructions in there that have combustible materials. Again, this isn't necessarily an issue in its own right, but what we have found is that there is an absence of fire barriers at walls and floor levels, compartment walls and compartment floor levels, and therefore we are recommending that you'd either have to remove the combustible insulation and or provide adequate fire breaks at junctions with compartment floors and party walls between flats. If you go to the next slide, please, Connor. Thank you. This slide again just shows the wall constructions, and you can see that there's a mixture of wall constructions on each elevation, but they combine together to form a single wall construction in effect. Similarly, we've looked at the balcony construction. On the elevation on the left-hand photograph, there are balconies where we think that the risk of fire spread via the balcony construction warrants replacement of the timber decking on that particular elevation. On the photo in the middle at the bottom of the slide, there are some balconies there where, because of the configuration of the balconies and a concrete floor slab that comes through those, we're satisfied that the materials there don't need replacement, provided obviously that the external wall in that location is appropriately remediated. Thanks, Connor.
Thanks for that, Neil. Really appreciate that. Now moving on to the next steps. This is what our next steps are in progressing the project forward. And the big question here is the Build Safety Fund, which is the fund that has been announced by the government for helping remediate these projects. Now, currently we've completed the pre-application steps, and it's really important that the graphic on your screen here that you can see where we've got some completion targets. These are the targets that have currently been set by the government. There is talk in the industry that these are not realistic at this time and they may change slightly, but at the moment we're working to these targets, and this is where we see ourselves. So we've completed the pre-application steps. We registered our interest in the fund immediately. We provided the stage 1 information when requested. We've had confirmation of receipt, and we had a call with them last week to clarify that that's all been provided, and the contents have been passed across to the government officials now to progress into a first stage of the full application. In order to progress the application, once we get here, we've got a target of roughly November to submit online the full application, and legal due diligence will be completed, and a short form agreement would be issued if the government feel that we have a an opportunity to progress our funding application. The second stage, which is roughly to be completed in December, is to submit the tender of the costs and the works. The government will then assess the eligibility of the full works and the costs, and finally provide a funding decision. This currently is expected to be completed around December, but as I said, these are the guidelines that are set by the government at this time, and we're working to these. So what can we do to help progress this application as fast as possible? We're already going to start working on our next steps to make sure that we're fully on board and that we're completing this as fast as possible for the leaseholders. So we are going to issue a Section 20. Now, issuing a Section 20 doesn't mean that the cost will be going to leaseholders. We have to issue a Section 20 regardless of where the money is coming from. It is for the use, it's there for the disbursement of funds from the service charge over the amount of £250 per leaseholder. So I just want to make sure that's really clear. It also takes a minimum of 90 days to complete Section 20. So we want to be ensured that when we get to a stage that we are able to begin works on site, that regardless of any funding or where the money has come from, that we're in a clear position to be able to progress our next steps. We're also going to issue some state aid declaration forms. We'll issue the guidance that comes with them from the government, and these have to be signed and returned to us as soon as possible. These are utilised in the full application in the future. We haven't been asked for them yet, but we want to make sure that we're in front of our competitors and in front of the crowd when we get this completed. I can't stress the importance to leaseholders to make sure that we get these completed, we get these back. We will work with you and we will provide as much guidance as we possibly can. We'll be giving you copies of the guidance from the government on what these forms are, what they stand for, and what you need to do to get this completed. So that will all be coming to you in the next couple of weeks. We've set ourselves a target of September 2020 to complete that. So you should receive that in the post shortly. So the question on everyone's mind is, what have the government said that they will cover at the moment? So the government have provided some form of guidance. Now, we haven't been handed a case handler at this time yet, so we've not been able to ask many questions about what the government will and won't cover. They've made it clear that they won't cover operation and running costs, such as the wake and watch, but they have also included elements that they will cover. If the Building Safety Fund doesn't cover something that has to be done, what will happen? Well, we will only be conducting the works that are necessary and required. We will consult with the freeholder on any item that is required that isn't covered by the Building Safety Fund, and I think it's important to remember that we will always work to minimise any costs to leaseholders. Works would be completed as part of this wider project. This is because we would never want to start a project, see this through, and then have to complete further works in order to get the required paperwork that we need to deem the building safe. We will ensure that you are consulted, given appropriate time to review any element that may fall into this area, and that we're able to progress this. Once we've had the opportunity to speak to a case handler from the fund, where we've been able to ask these questions ourselves, provide feedback to them and understand their reasoning for not providing to any element that they've said they will not cover, we'll be sure to pass this on to leaseholders. I want to make this extremely clear when I say this, that we understand that there is a lot of anxiety around what is covered and what isn't covered and how the funding will be distributed. We will work tirelessly to make sure that we get the best possible deal for our leaseholders. So how do we implement the remedial advice that is required? Now, the graphic on screen is not a be all and end all of the dates that will actually be in use. The graphic on screen is an example of our next steps and how long we estimate it would take from here onwards. As always with projects of this nature, this timeline could adapt and could change. The appointments for the future of the team and the next steps will include a cost consultant and a project manager for any remedial work that has to be required. The cost consultant is responsible to ensure that the tenders go smoothly, that we're receiving the best possible standards in the industry, and that we're able to justify the amount of money that is required to complete any remedial advice that is required. The project manager will oversee the project, ensuring that the client briefing, budget and concept design development are completed on time, that the tender exercise and review are as thorough and as detailed as required, and that if any appointed contractor is appointed and that the design developed, that is done successfully and in the timeframes that we require. The big step on here is the stage 11, which is the final account. This is when we believe that the EWS1 form will be available. The EWS1 form, once completed after this final account, is what could be utilised in unlocking the sales of apartments. There may also be a possibility that once, if any funding is granted to the building, that a letter from the government to state that this work is covered under the Building Safety Fund is provided to leaseholders, that they may be able to utilise this in the remortgage of their property or the sale of their property. At this time, we're not aware if that will or will not work, but we'll always be crystal clear and transparent when providing these documents to leaseholders in the future. So, the safety measures that we've had to put in place due to the information that has been reported in our reports. We have had to put a waking watch in place, and I'm sure that you're all very well aware of the waking watch on site. The waking watch is 5 operatives who patrol on a 24/7 basis, 365 days a year. They use a set route and they have a patrol system in place. The supply was selected not only on the cost but also on the competency to work on our site. We immediately employed a waking watch across our 4 buildings, and we worked with West Yorkshire Fire to use a systematic approach. It was only then that we also started to develop a system for the entire estate. This system has been put in place and includes buildings from around the dock. It's important to remember here that the safety of our project is the goal of our project is for the safety to all our residents who live within the buildings. It's not an easy decision for anyone to put a waking watch in place, as we understand that the financial impact that this does have on leaseholders. However, we have to be seen to be minimising any risk to any resident within the building. The whole estate system is a similar approach to what we used across our 4 developments. The process document was put together by Liv, reviewed by other managing agents, and advice taken from our fire engineer. We believe that this system made substantial savings across the entire estate. As you can see by the graphics on your screen right now, the average per leaseholder is roughly £48 per calendar month. I know that this does change based on your apportionments, which all differentiate per lease, but this is the average. Without the whole estate system, we could be seeing costings from £180 to £280 per calendar month. So while these costings have been added to leaseholders, we do feel that we are getting the best value for money at this time. While we've got leaseholders on this call, we wanted to take the opportunity to make sure that we really go through the safety measures and the evacuation procedure that is in place. We would like leaseholders to stress these safety measures to their residents and provide a really detailed analysis of the evacuation procedures at these buildings. The buildings are now non-smoking, therefore residents should not be smoking within their flats or on their balconies. In the event of discovering a fire, residents should immediately alert the nearest waking watch operative. The waking watch operatives will sound air horns across the development and will work in a cohesive manner to assist the fire brigade in the evacuation procedure at the building. We will be providing a copy of the evacuation procedure to all residents once again, and we will also be providing a copy to all leaseholders. As I previously said, I would recommend that leaseholders ensure that their residents provided a copy and that the importance of following this procedure is passed through to them. So we've come to the end of our actual presentation and the information that we've been able to share today. We're now going to start taking some questions from those that have emailed in to our Leadstock email address, and a colleague of mine, Helen Peace, who is the Senior Operations Director, is kindly offered to read these questions out to us. We will get through as many as we can, and as I've said previously, those questions that we're not able to answer tonight, we will be shortly issuing a future edition of our newsletter where we'll be able to share answers to hopefully all of your questions that you submitted. We do promise that we will eventually come back to you with an answer and that we will provide answers to all your questions in the future. So I thank everyone for listening to the presentation, and we'll now begin the process of our question and answer session.
Thanks, Connor. The first question is, can we share a recording presentation?
Yes, we will shortly be sharing a recording of the presentation. As I said at the start, there's no requirement for leaseholders to record this session. We will be sharing it on our website, and you'll be able to watch it as many times as you would like.
You state balconies are not integral to the cladding and that they therefore will not be funded by the government. What does this mean and why, and does it apply here? 3 questions in one.
Yeah, so three very good questions really. So Neil, I'm not sure if you managed to pick that up. Would you be able to provide a bit of detail on the balconies to the development?
So as far as we know, the government has explicitly stated that it will not fund replacement of balconies. The reasoning for that, we don't know. I think that they have to be reviewed in the context of the external wall system as a whole. And that's how I've been reviewing them and will advise and conclude in my report.
Who is responsible for funding the cost consultant and project manager?
So the cost consultant and the project manager, at the moment they'll be appointed to the project. The government have stated that they will cover some professional fees. They haven't provided much guidance on what the professional fees are at this stage, but these are areas that are required as part of the wider project. And the quotes at the moment have been gained, and they're shortly going to be going over to the freeholder to make a decision on the appointment in these roles.
Whilst the NHBC warranty is expired, as cladding was a known issue at the time following Grenfell, is there no recourse to claim this under the warranty?
So we have begun the process now that we've got the information. So to be able to assess any liability from any other external party, the freeholder is leading the way with this side of the project, and it will be an area that their legal teams will look into. The NHBC warranty did expire, and the warranty on the building is no longer in place. And obviously there is some other elements to consider in this as well, such as previous cladding replacements have taken place on Cartier House. And once again, this is another area that the freeholder is going to look into, is going to assess. Their legal team are going to be taking this on board. And if there is any party that is potentially liable for any of the issues that we've seen today, the freeholder will be looking to take some form of legal action. However, it is all under review. There is no definite next steps, and there is no definite person that is responsible or organisation, should I say, that is responsible at this time.
Neil, this question I think is for you. What has the survey revealed and what remedial works are recommended? For clarity and lay terms, please reconfirm the issues that there are with the insulation, compartmentation, fire breaks, fire barriers, cladding, and fire alarm system, and any other points. That's quite a lot of subject there.
It's actually quite a difficult question to answer simply because all of those things interrelate. If we think of the buildings separately, on the tower portion of Clarence House, I think that the remediation is likely to be limited to balcony decking replacement. On the brickwork parts of balcony house of Clarence House, we will look at what the most cost-effective approach is. But at the moment, the issue that needs to be resolved is that there's combustible insulation behind the brickwork without adequate fire barriers, and we need to look at which is the best to fix. My expectation is that will be putting fire barriers in line with compartment floors and compartment walls, but the insulation itself can stay in place. And on LaSalle, it will vary for the different parts of the building, but I think the easiest way to summarize it for LaSalle is that the primary issue, I think, will be with fire barriers and compartmentation and inserting those rather than replacing cladding systems.
Sorry, Neil, just to interject there. When you were saying LaSalle, did you mean Cartier? Sorry.
Sorry, I did. It's the slide that I'm actually looking at says LaSalle on it, but you're right. I meant Cartier. Apologies.
Yeah, no.
When we provide fire safety guidance for us to share with our tenants, and why is it not being provided before, given the risk?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Guidance has been provided to the tenants directly. This has been completed on a couple of occasions. We put this into mailboxes and we have put a few posters up across the site. I do agree it's really important that we get this message out in a lot stronger fashion. This includes the no smoking element of the building, and that we ask residents to be at least over 5 metres away from the building, from our building exclusion zone that we've put in place. So we are going to reinforce this message. We've this week been looking at how we're going to actually do this on site in a much more better way rather than just mail dropping every couple of months like we have been doing. We're going to look at some proper signage and make sure that this is expressed to residents as it is for their benefit and it's for their safety that we've made these changes to the building's fire strategy.
What is the total estimated cost today of the remedial works?
So at the moment, and I know this is a really big question for everyone, and this is causing a lot of anxiety out there, how much is this going to cost on each building? Now, in all honesty, we don't have a cost, and we're not, unfortunately, in a position to be able to provide a cost. This is simply because we're not the experts on this. We're not, construction experts, and we're not sure of the finalised specifications yet. It's important to remember that we only just got the finalised remediation advice recently, and that this is what we are now using to begin our next programme of works. So I understand and I fully agree with leaseholders that we need to get to a position where we have these costs. We're going to be in that position shortly in the future, but our goal is by December that we're in a position where not only have we got the cost, we're ready for Q1 to begin works, and that's following the guidelines that's set by the government. And that'll really set the tempo for our next steps. So I do emphasise that we will push this as hard and as fast as possible, and as soon as we do have a cost, we'll make sure that leaseholders are aware of that cost, and we'll get that out there via our newsletter, whether it be another session such as this. But until that time, unfortunately, we just don't have a figure to mind. We don't have a ballpark figure for any of the buildings, and that's all we have on that at the moment.
This question is on a similar line, and you may have answered some of it in there already, but I want to sort of raise it so that we make sure that we cover it fully. When will the work commence and how long to completion?
So as I say, we're looking to start the works as soon as possible. We've got the next steps laid out as we show you tonight, and we know what map we have to follow to get to where we need to be. Ideally, we would like to complete works in Q1 2021 if any works are required. That's the goal, and that's where me and the team and the wider management at Live really want to see this project progress to. The freeholders obviously have the final say on everything, but this is our coordination role in the project is to make sure that we're driving as fast as possible, and that's the position that we want to be in. Obviously, projects such as this, it's not just as simple as flicking a button and suddenly we can have people on the ground working. It will take time to get to where we want to be, and it's really important you keep up to date with our communications, where we will express any delays, any issues, or anything that we've encountered that may cause delay to our plans. So we will keep you updated via them methods.
And an ancillary question to that is, why are you waiting to submit the online application, conduct legal due diligence, and agree to a short form agreement in November? And what are you doing in September and October?
So that's fully fine, and I understand that. This isn't actually down to us to the timeline that we've got on these. As we've said earlier, it is a government targets for these, and we're working to them targets. Now, we don't have an online portal yet because you have to get through the pre-application steps and you have to do them. We've submitted all that information. It's now with the government for review. Once they've reviewed that and they've agreed that we're able to progress into that full application status, that is when we will be able to submit this. And we are in a very healthy position in a sense that we're ready to go. soon as we get that confirmation that that's all been set up, that will, be when we begin it. It's important to remember that the government have got a lot of applications coming at the minute, and they are progressing as quickly as possible. As I say, we had a good call with them last week where they confirmed that they've received our emails, where we've included the O&Ms, the plans that we've made today, the stage 1 and stage 2 surveys, the fire risk assessments and facade risk assessments that have been completed by Neil, and they've got a lot of information to review on a lot of buildings at the moment. So we will see that progress over time, and when we're not waiting, there's not a case that we're sat around thinking, oh, we'll do this in December. We will continue to progress doing the Section 20s, like we've said. We'll be progressing the state aid funding forms, and if there's any other information that the government need in that time frame, we'll be completing that during the period that we're waiting to be able to finalise our stage 1 of the full application.
December is the shortest commercial month, and yet you're looking to submit the tender and set the works, and waiting for the safety grant to be awarded. Why are you leaving it so late?
Yeah, another perfectly valid question. As we've said previously, the government's guidelines and completion targets that we've been informed of is what really set the tempo for which we can submit documents and complete areas of this project. We want to be in this position way ahead of the completion targets, but these are the completion targets that we've got for these, and these are what we work towards. It's not a case of waiting around until it's as long as possible. It's a case of we're ready to go. We're waiting on the government now to progress our applications.
The overhang outside of Cartier House is often used by non-residents for smoking, including visitors to Pizza Express. How are we ensuring that's stopped?
Yeah, no, perfect question. As we've said previously, we've got the Wake and Watch in place. We train them frequently, and I agree that there is areas where perhaps the rules are not being followed as they should be. These are to be addressed by myself as the property manager of the area. We do have a 5 metre exclusion zone in the buildings where we don't want anybody to be smoking or conduct any possible actions that may cause a fire to start. Residents and non-residents do smoke in that area, and we'll work with the estate team and the estate managers to try and manage that the best that we can. It's really about getting good housekeeping across the wider estate as well. And we are going to enter discussions with the estate owner to see if it's possible to fetch in some form of more support to do this.
Okay. Another question for you, Neil. What are compartment and compartmentation barriers, and does this involve replacing walls?
So each flat should be separated from every other flat by a fire-resisting wall or floor. Those are the internal walls between flats and the floors between flats. Where those walls and floors come to the outside of the building, they meet the external wall, and there's a junction, and that junction needs to be fire stopped between the gap between the internal floors and walls and the outside wall. And then what you often have is a cavity in the external wall. So if you think of a traditional house construction, you've got an internal brick wall that's, when I say internal, sorry, it's part of the outside wall, but there's an inner skin of brickwork, and then a gap, and then an outer skin of brickwork. And there's meant to be a fire barrier lining up with the internal walls and floors in that cavity, such that it's not a big undivided cavity going up the full height of the building. So those are what I'm referring to as the cavity barriers and the fire barriers. They need to be in the external wall construction to stop fire spread going around the compartment floors and walls that separate flats from each other. So in a number of situations, those are missing, and need to be installed. How you do that depends on situation to situation, but what we will try to always do is do it from the outside of the building. So you remove some bricks, or you remove some of the cladding, so that you can get at the place where the barrier should be. You put the barrier back in, and then you put the cladding or brickwork back over the top of it, and that's the least intrusive way of doing it for residents, because it means you don't have to do it from inside people's flats.
Okay, thanks, Neil. I think this question might be for you as well. Who signs off the EWS 1? Is it the fire engineer or CBRE?
So it would be, in this instance, the fire engineer, and if we continue to be involved and appointed to do so, then we would do that when all the works have been completed.
Will a waiting watch be required when the works begin and the contract is on site?
Yeah, no, so I'll jump on this one. So we will continue to engage with West Yorkshire Fire throughout the course of the works. We're not entirely sure when the waiting watch will be able to be relieved from the buildings. I would suspect it is upon practical completion, but as we progress the project and as we get through the next levels, we will work with West Yorkshire Fire to understand and update our strategy document. As such, I think West Yorkshire Fire are awaiting feedback from government on this area as well. And it's vital to remember that the working watch is in place for the safety of the residents. So once that risk has been removed from residents, that is when the working watch will be able to stand back. And I know that to expand on this question, I know there's been a bit of what about if one building finishes before the next building, and would that mean that our costs will increase? The waiting watch, the way it's set up to make it so that the amount of operatives is per buildings. As buildings leave the waiting watch system, less amount of operatives are required, down to a minimum of 3. So we would see the cost reduce as the buildings leave as well. So we suspect that by side that will level each other out to some extent.
Yeah, is that you typing? Off your mute if you don't mind. If the safety fund is granted, are you able to provide a letter that can be given to lenders and buyers to outline what is covered by the safety fund and the sinking fund, and non-leaseholders, and what is being funded by leaseholders, so that this helps leaseholders to potentially sell or remortgage their properties?
Yeah, no, another perfectly good question. Yes, once we get to a stage that any agreement is made on any potential funding, we would expect that there is a formal letter appointed to us, and we would, with the freeholder and ourselves, be happy to share this to hopefully free up the opportunity to sell apartments. We're not sure if that'll work, like I say. It's not something that's happened yet in the industry, but we'll be more than happy to be providing that sort of information to anyone selling the apartment, and it may be a case that does start the sale process again.
There are 36 wooden balconies in the 18-storey construction of Clarence house. Considering there is no right of access to work from the flat internally, will you be seeking individual permissions or paying to scaffold both blocks? And can you confirm that this will be covered by the fund?
Yeah, no, so a really good question. The way that any balcony replacement works would be completed is up for discussion. That'll obviously be approached during the design specification stage with the contractor and with any architect or anything like that that's appointed to the project. In terms of right of access, there is a right of access through the lease for such works, given that appropriate notice is provided. But on that, we're not just going to go through everyone's apartment and tear residents' lives upside down. I think a key element here is to work not only with those on site, but also to work with yourselves as leaseholders to understand which is not only the best way to do things, not only the most cost-effective way to do things, but also one that works for everyone. And we will cross that bridge when we get to it. Once we have a design specification and once we have a construction specification in place, that's when we can start to review the finer details, such as how we will provide, how we will be conducting these works, like scaffold, abseiling, or anything like that that may be utilised, and the access equipment that will be required.
This question actually you partly answered there, but Neil, I think if you could pick this one up. Are the proposed works likely to be highly intrusive, disruptive, and will they mean that the building has to be evacuated or left unoccupied until the works are completed?
So my expectation is that the works are likely to be quite extensive. They will certainly be very noticeable, but they will all be done from the outside of the building, and there will be unlikely to be any need for people to vacate flats whilst the works are being done.
Okay, thank you. Who and how will you decide which tenders to award?
So, as we said earlier, a cost analysis expert will be as part of the quote from the project management team. We will obviously be submitting all the tenders that we receive to the government application, and the cost and the decision on this will be ultimately down to the freeholder on which quote we go ahead with. It'll most likely be down to cost, but there is also other factors to consider, such as time frames for completion, ability to start works, and all other elements such as that. So all this will be decided in the future, and we'll keep you updated, like I say, through our communication channels, through the monthly newsletters, through the future calls that we've got in place, of the tenders that we received, of the amount of them tenders, and how long we expect each one will take to implement and complete, and ultimately which tender is successful in their bid to complete the remediation work.
Each affected block on these stuff we understand separate projects, but clearly it would be difficult to have 5 different contractors on site starting work, and highly impractical. Are you looking to appoint different contractors for each block, or just one that does all the work?
No, a perfectly good question once again. We would market each building individually. Each building is its own project. It'll have its own design spec, and each building will take a different amount of time to complete, and all them other elements. So each building is fundamentally its own project. I would suspect that a contractor and a major developer, such as what's going to be potentially be required in this case, would see the benefit of having all 4 buildings together. I would suspect that most of the contractors will be able to do a price based on that analogy, and that limits costings as well, such as site offices and materials, and all that sort of stuff that's needed for such a project. So I would suspect that it would most likely be one contractor that will ultimately get the majority of buildings here, and it is unlikely that we'll see different contractors working across different buildings. But that is something that we will review and work with and work on once we get to a stage that we've received tenders for the work.
What is involved in obtaining an EWS1? Who will cover the cost, and how long does it take to obtain it?
So an EWS1 is, like Neil was pointed out earlier, once the fire engineer is happy that the building is safe and is able to provide a detailed analysis of the breakdown. It's a form that's been created by the government, and it will be part of the future scope for the project to be signed off by a fire engineer. The cost of this will be decided at the time. It may be possible that it is covered under the professional fees of the Building Safety Fund, but that is a question that we will be asking ourselves once we have a case handler on the project.
Can I just add to that, Connor? The form is not actually created by government. It's being created by the Chartered Institute of Building Surveyors in conjunction with mortgage providers and valuers. to answer the question about costs, if on work that design fire consultants is appointed to for remedial works, government funded remedial works, the cost of providing the EWS1 form will be included in our fees. There'll be no additional charge for that.
Brilliant. No, thanks for that, Neil, and yeah, thanks for the clarity as well. That's really appreciated.
Thank you. Yeah. Who signed off the building, and do any of those involved still exist as an entity?
So the buildings were signed off by Leeds City Council Building Control. Unfortunately, that does mean it's quite hard for any liability to be passed on to them, which I suspect is the reason behind that question. There is obviously going to be review into that, as we've said, in the future. Now we've got the remediation advice, we're able to actually begin to look at liable parties, and that is something that the freeholder is very interested in doing so in this case.
Okay, I think we've got time just for a couple more questions. Why are you looking to serve a Section 20 before all of the costs have been finalised and government funding approved?
Yeah, no, I think I tried to mention this point earlier. I understand that some people think if they receive a Section 20 in the post, that's going to mean that they're liable for the costs. It's not the case. It's the case that we have to serve this in order to be able to spend the money. Regardless of where the money's come from, whether that be via a sinking fund or via additional collections or via public funding such as the Build Safety Fund. So we want to make sure that when we are able to actually press the green button and begin works on site, that we're in a position to do so, and part of that process is making sure that we've done the Section 20 regardless of the funding, of where the funding is coming from. So it's not a case that we're looking to pass across the leaseholders and that this is us preparing for that. It's a case of we're preparing to be able to start works on site.
And our final question tonight is, when will the full report be released to leaseholders, and who ultimately makes that decision to release the report?
So the full report, we haven't set a date yet for release. I would envision it will be very shortly after these presentations. There is still some areas that need to be reviewed by the freeholder, and the freeholder is reviewing them at the moment. They will ultimately sign off on the release of the reports. You know, it's their report as such to agree to release, and we'll work with them to coordinate that release, and we will work with leaseholders to be able to understand the information that's contained, and we'll get to that point once we can. I imagine, like I say, it's not far away now. We've been able to share information from that report with yourselves tonight, and we actually look forward to being able to release it so that leaseholders can have a better understanding of the issues faced with the building. I think, as Helen mentioned, that's the last question that we're going to do.
Sorry, I have one more.
Oh, one more.
Just come in. I think while we've got Neil on, it would be useful, Neil, if you could answer this for us. The slide shown this evening seems to suggest there was no government funding for non-cladding issues. Is a lack of fire breaks a cladding issue or a non-fire issue, non-issue?
The government criteria for eligibility for funding is based on the combustibility of materials in the external wall construction. Our understanding of it is that if the building is eligible for funding, it will include any works to remediate the risk of that combustible material. So in the case of these buildings, they are eligible because they have combustible insulation, and it is my understanding that the costs, the fund will include the costs associated with fixing fire barriers in eligible buildings.
Brilliant. That's great, Neil. Thank you for answering that last question there.
Can I just add to that, is that a lot of this is still unknown because we're still at the early days of the process with government, and we don't yet know exactly what's going to be funded. So that's my understanding, but I can't, I can't guarantee that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was just going to follow on with a similar point that is a very good question that we will be asking our case handler once it has been appointed. And we've got lots of questions along the similar lines to be following on with our case handler. I just want to finish by thanking Neil for your time. It's been really appreciated, and you've really provided some great knowledge, and hopefully the leaseholders that are on the call tonight will have found this beneficial. Also, thanks to Helen for reading out the questions, and thanks to everyone that's tuned in and asked questions and become involved. Continue to send your questions into the lease stock email. As we've said, we're planning a special edition of the newsletter where we'll answer any questions that we've not been able to answer tonight. And I'd just like to thank everyone for the opportunity to present this to you, and I look forward to working with you all on the future as we begin to remediate the issues that we found at these buildings. So yes, thank you for everyone's time, and we'll end the stream now.